Welcome to the Lawless Astrology channel. My name is Dabney Lawless and I'm an evolutionary astrologer. I am excited to welcome back Ronnie Pontiac, who is a Renaissance man. He is a filmmaker, he's an author, he is an expert in esoteric studies, and he's an incredible astrologer. So please check out his YouTube channel. Also, he does a weekly astrology forecast on Instagram that I love to follow, and all that information will be below, as well as a link to his book. So today we're going to be talking about the upcoming astrology, a lot of big things happening in 2025 and beyond, and so I welcome Ronnie.
I'm so happy to be back here to talk with you, Dabney.
Yeah, I'm not sure if you know this, but you were one of my first interviews, and you were still that interview has the most views of anything that I've done. And
Oh,
so yeah, it really blew up and it has been just a real fan favorite. And I think that having you back again to talk about kind of closing out this year in 2025 and what we can expect is going to be a real treat. So,
thank you.
especially since it's so crazy. I think I just saw a cattail.
Oh,
Ronnie has
good.
cats too.
Hopefully one of them will make an appearance.
So, okay. So yeah, before when we were off camera, we were talking about kind of the shock of the election results, but not the shock, right? Kind of this like Aquarius is so unpredictable and Pluto going into Aquarius. And now we've got a bunch of other big outer planets switching over into new signs. So, where do you want to start?
Well, I think maybe it's good to, first of all, to point out from the very questionable, but I think useful metaphorical viewpoint on all of this of comparing it to a human being confronting his or her shadow. America, in the midst of its Pluto return now, is in the midst of confronting its shadow. And ironically or not, Donald Trump came up just at the right time for America's Pluto return. And he has forced a confrontation with so many shadow aspects of the American psyche. We idolize gangsters. We like bold, unethical, successful people. We like a good liar over somebody who's factual. There's all sorts of these American shadow qualities that have been um, satirized throughout our history and certainly to some degree remain true. And I think on the other hand, that what I believe I discussed with you having to do with the way that the American Pluto return is square Eris, right, which makes it all the more kind of drastic and relates it to disenfranchised people, to injustice, to people who are not invited to the party. That this influence suggests, from my point of view, that the election was actually, to a degree, a success because America ran and voted to the tune of over 70 million, a woman of color to be president who had tremendous support and was tremendous wealth was brought to bear to support her. And the kinds of things that were being talked about from her platform were things that had not in America been acceptable to discuss even in the 1990s. I can tell you from my experience. So I can tell you that in the 1990s, when I was in a Riot Girl band, that the kinds of issues that showed up in the Democratic platform, such as concern for trans kids, concern for gay rights, concern for women to get autonomy, bodily autonomy, and some of the more nuanced concerns that were being discussed that providing help for people who have to caretake their aged parents and such, that these were the kinds of issues that were limited to radical thinkers in the 90s. And they're now part of the national discussion. They made it onto the platform of one of the two major parties. And although I do think that the race and gender of the Democratic candidate was an issue in this country where racism and misogyny are still rampant among a significant portion of people, it was also rather stunning from my point of view to see massive support to the tune of over 70 million votes for such a progressive platform. So I think that if you step back, you can say, well, America, maybe we didn't do, great in this election, but we did at least show that we have made significant progress. And even the Trump administration itself, when you compare it to the kinds of governments that existed at the time when, let's say, rock and roll was born in the 50s, the 60s, even the early 70s, when you had this monolithic white conformist Christian culture that people did not question with deeply built-in misogyny. And I mean, women were not even allowed to have credit cards or open their own bank accounts until this era. And so that in that time, there many amazing things happened while the government itself was run by people like Ronald Reagan, who was then governor of California, and who said about the hippies who were protesting, let the bloodbath begin, because they were dirty communists and had to be beaten into submission. I mean, that kind of thinking was already in America. It's always been here. And one of the great revolutions of culture originated from that kind of an environment. So when you look at the administration that he's trying to select, you're seeing people of color, you're seeing women. We may not agree with the choices or their ideologies, but we can see that this is a far cry from, let's call it the Nixon era of white Republican control over culture. And the level of demonization that was inflicted on people in those days, it was inflicted on women's sexuality. It was inflicted on people who were gender fluid, and a lot of that is, even though there's a lot of hate still, but there's now a lot of acceptance. There's a lot of awareness and support that didn't exist in those days. So I do want to start by emphasizing that it was still a step forward for America to see that kind of support for a woman of color running with some of those platform issues. And the community that developed from it, the sense of joy and agency that was acquired from that election is not going to go away. It's going to find ways to express itself in our communities, in our families. The fight isn't over. And in fact, I think that we're going to see potentially a great flowering of culture because of it. Because as we were talking about, projects that under the world of Biden seemed unimportant. For example, my wife Tamara, who was working on a book about her experiences as our front woman during the Riot Girl days and her friendship with the Warhol superstar drag queen Holly Woodlawn, and during the Biden years, when people were asking her, when is the book coming out and how's it going, she was kind of bored with it. She felt like it was ancient history and that most of this stuff had been settled out and didn't need to be discussed. Now, after this election and the obvious misogyny and comments like, your body, my choice forever, and just a really blatant kind of woman-hating return to the traditional American point of view, unfortunately, for so much of our history, has made a book about those days important because it captures the history of these women who refused to accept those conditions and who fought against it at a time when the odds against them were so much greater. There was so much less community. There was so much less acceptance in the media and in the world in general for those kinds of ideas. So I think that you're going to see that kind of dynamic in millions of places. People's ideas for businesses, their ideas for books, their ideas for music, their ideas for new political approaches, anything you can imagine, I think will be galvanized actually by this loss and by the desire to express this higher conviction, this our better angels, as Lincoln called them, in ways that we still have control over. So we may have lost control on the reins of government. We may have to go on this crazy wagon ride and see where we're going to get taken, but there's still so much that we can do.
Yeah. No, I mean, I believe, the election took place under Pluto and Capricorn, and I still see Trump as a very Capricornian, Pluto and Capricorn figure. But I do believe the what I've called the wrecking ball that I believe is coming our way for institutions that in a lot of ways have not been working. Because a lot
Mhm.
of what I attribute this to, you said about Eris, the anger of not being invited to the party. Well, the people that used to be invited to the party were no longer invited to the party. And that's who showed up in droves. The people who used to be the belle of the ball. And then,
Mhm.
now they have to share. And that's a really hard feeling when the
Mhm.
party's not all for you. And so I do think I think there's a deep desire with this new administration to actually go back. And, I've even read some things about wanting to take away a woman's right to vote. But I don't necessarily think that will happen because like you said, it was very split 50-50. This country is very split, and with this wrecking ball, there may be opportunities to have more common ground visible than has been
Mhm.
for the past 8-9 years. So that's
Well,
my
I think so.
that's my my silver lining.
Yeah, I agree. And I think I agree with you also that the change is very necessary, that we have very dysfunctional institutions and we have all this new technology. There was going to be a day of reckoning when we had to update how we do things. Now, is Elon Musk the guy that we all would have chosen for that job? Probably not. But somebody had to step in there and maybe to talk to your wrecking ball analogy, maybe we need them to be the wrecking ball to get in there to open it up so it can be fixed because
Yeah, it's
first you
broken.
have to knock it down and open up all those limits. But the other thing is that the United States government is set up as this maze within a maze of bureaucracy and laws. Every institution, so for example, most of the institutions that we know of, like the Department of Education, are established by Congress. And in order to end the department or change the nature of its mission, you have to go through this torturous years-long process that involves Congress and the courts and countersuits, and it probably winds up at the Supreme Court eventually. And that's for every tiny change. Not like I can do one case for all the changes. Every mandated change, which Congress has declared in these years that have become the Department of Education, would have to be individually challenged and will be challenged by opponents who don't want the change made. So there's a lot of inertia built into the system where people can't really just come in and rip it open. What the real challenge for all of us is reinvention. Look at the media. Um, it's useless at this point almost, right? I mean, you've got, Fox News was an extremely successful organization putting out propaganda. We can't say that MSNBC wasn't spinning, 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 and then CNN tried its weird roundtable with, we'll represent everybody and therefore represent nobody and have no point of view. The great newspapers soft sold him and sane washed him and much too late decided that he was a threat and a risk. And who cares anyway? Because even if the New York Times had come out from the beginning and said he was that, who would it have influenced? Not that many people. So if you look at the numbers of people who watch CNN, for example, who watch Fox, and then you look at the numbers who listen to Joe Rogan, you've got a complete this is like, we still think as 20th century kind of uh, people, because so much of the 21st century is still controlled by 20th century ideas. We still think of the media and the news and the newspapers as having this influence and this importance that clearly the Trump campaign recognized they do not have anymore. And so all of this has to be reinvented. There are still people out there, journalists and people who want spin-free news, and there have to be inventions. There have to be communities that come together to create better ways of doing these things, better ways of sharing information. And we need to also cut through this Pluto and Capricorn demonization. This really existed on both sides.
Propaganda works.
Mhm.
And when you have billionaires controlling the media,
Mhm.
there isn't it has not been factual, and I do believe billionaires have now been controlling our governments in Citizens United. And so to me, ultimately, what I've always said is right or left, the average person doesn't want to pay attention to politics. They want to raise their families. They want to, and so the propaganda against one another has been incredibly successful,
Yeah.
and that has to stop. And
Mhm.
I'm hopeful that there is not, moving forward after the wrecking ball, a two-party system. I hope there's a multi-party system, because
Yeah.
it is too ripe for corruption. And
Mhm.
that's what ultimately, it built and built and built, since the New Deal, where we became a much healthier society because
Mhm.
we had a growing middle class.
Mhm.
And since the 80s, the middle class has been shrinking, and it
Mhm.
shrunk to the point where it broke. And
Yeah.
then there's propaganda everywhere, mainstream media, far right, far left, you name it. And
Yeah.
it has not been serving the people. And so that's where the Pluto and Aquarius bit, I do believe, will emerge. But, this is a 20-year cycle. And so
Yeah.
what's going to happen? And the other thing before we move on is like,
Yeah.
and we're going to talk about this, is the other outer planets and how they interact with Aquarius makes Pluto and Aquarius makes a big difference throughout
Yeah.
history.
Yes, absolutely. And so let's talk about what the immediate future looks like. From my point of view, the first half of 2025, beginning now, is going to be quite a roller coaster ride. And there's a couple reasons for that. First of all, we should consider something that's just about to happen, which is the Mars station retrograde, same week as Neptune stationary direct. So this very powerful Mars Neptune, both of them being amplified by these stations, but the Mars in particular, because it's in opposition to Pluto. And that means it's in opposition to the natal US Pluto. And so this is kind of the Mars chapter of the US Pluto return, which we've been going through now for years. And it is drawing near to its close, but it's still active. And so that is a violent aspect. It's an aspect of suspicion and polarization and force. And so I think we can expect feelings to continue to run very high, and that people will be expressing their frustration through lashing out, either verbally or in action. I would counsel people to drive extra carefully over the next few months, because I do think that people will be acting out in traffic even more than usual. And I think that this split is going to continue to be exasperated by the trolling that the GOP really seems to get a big kick out of, and also just by the actions that will unfold as this party takes control over the Congress and the White House. And so that drags out. I mean, it's really with us through the second week of January, but I would argue that since it's going to come back and again exactly oppose Pluto in April, that in a way from now all the way through April, we're dealing with this Mars-Pluto opposition, because in that period between January and April, when the opposition becomes in more of less of of an intense orb, usually outside of what we would consider to be the actual orb of application. But I think that we'll be seeing the consequences of what it did while it was in orb all the way through into April, and then we're visiting the exact opposition again then. So that says to me that this is an extended period now where in the wars, in the effort to change the government. So they're going to come out of the chute very aggressive. They're going to try to take all of these actions that will radically change the way everything is done. Some of them will succeed, and many of them will fall into this morass of bureaucracy that's been intentionally created to slow down those kinds of efforts. I think that for us as human beings in our own lives, it's going to be important to learn how to detach. We're in for 4 years of shocking events, just like we were last time. And if we become hopelessly addicted to what's going to happen next, and we're constantly in a state of outrage or despair, about the changes that are being made and the clickbait headlines that are produced to take advantage of those changes, it's going to be a very hard time for people, bad for health, bad for relationships. And it will be important to be able to practice detachment, to be able to focus on a daily basis on the things that really matter to us, the people and the things that we cherish about life, and to find ways to express ourselves through little missions, projects, helping somewhere, volunteering perhaps, so that we can have constructive action and not be simply helpless spectators strung out on what the feed has to say. I think that to a degree that's what the GOP is counting on is they want to exhaust people with shocking news, shocking events and statements, and that makes people lose their agency. It means that we become so tired and embittered and pessimistic that we no longer take the actions that we could to improve the situation. Because Mars opposition Pluto can also be a very effective aspect, one that allows us to see, thanks to Pluto, where reforms and repairs are needed, that allows us to see what the greater good is and what other people's good might be. And then we can adjust that Mars, the ambition, the anger, even libido, into ways that are more functional, more effective. And it's a good time to refine how you approach making your mark in the world. So why waste it on suspicion and outrage and conspiracy theories and reacting to every single crazy thing that's proposed? When, for example, look at the Matt Gaetz thing. I mean, people were completely going mad about it. It seemed like mad, but he didn't have a chance, and he saw that himself. So it's not always going to be Trump gets everything that he wants. There's going to be a lot of other things happening. And so I think that's one thing we need to deal with. Now, what an opportunity. Okay, I hate to, this sounds so crazy, but these kind of times are golden for developing your soul, for meditating, for learning patience, learning forbearance, learning to see both sides of issues, learning to communicate with people who disagree. It's something that we can use to help us deal with stress and anxiety and learn to be more effective in managing those things. And so I think we should try to view this period as a bumpy road, but one that will help us to become stronger and give us greater clarity and will help us to become further acquainted with this American shadow that needs to be integrated.
Yeah, I love that too because I think that there is a change that people have already felt, like almost like as soon as Pluto went into Aquarius, there is kind of an awakening. And with Mars, Mars is very dramatic. Mars in Leo is very dramatic. And
Mhm.
so there is the like fear, you can spin up all these fears and you can get yourself all in a tizzy. But kind of the higher meaning of it, what you're saying is like, where do you conserve your energy? Where do you put your energy? And can you unearth the fears that have been festering in you that are not acknowledged? Your own personal work that you can do. And we can't impact the collective other than each individual person. And so I really like what you're saying about channeling our energy into right causes and not getting all spun up. I mean, I honestly I've been off of Twitter since mush took over, but I know a lot of people who are still putting all of this tremendous energy into something that's it was toxic for them, both
Mhm.
sides, right?
Mhm.
And so
Mhm.
now people are finding other places to go, like saying, like, I don't want to engage in this toxicity anymore. And so that's
Mhm.
kind of a healthy expression of that Mars Pluto, where it's like,
Yeah,
I need to do something differently because this
exactly.
is just festering toxicity.
And look at where we're coming from, as you mentioned. Saturn in Pisces, endings, 29 roughly year cycle. Uh, when Saturn hits Pisces at the end of a cycle like that, there's a general feeling in society of, oh wow, it's all over. It's the only bad things are ahead. I'm scared of what's next. And that's classic Saturn Pisces behavior. We have Neptune in Pisces. Now we're talking about a cycle that goes all the way back to the 1860s. And this cycle, which coincided with the birth of the Confederacy, has lasted all these years, and we saw it flare up. There were racial issues. If you look at the map for voting, it's still the southern slave states that are the stronghold of the GOP, and so I'm not suggesting that everybody that lives there is racist, but just if you look at the map, you kind of look at wow, that looks like the Civil War. If you look at the eastern side of it, and so that is typical of Neptune in Pisces, the feeling of it's over. We didn't really progress. We're all exhausted and everything is a lie. It's all illusion anyway. There's no way to know what's true anymore. And what's going to happen to us next? Woe is us. And then when you had Pluto and Capricorn on top of it, yikes. I mean, another one. And then we had talked about the 29th degree. So Pluto dwelling this year in the 29th degree for so long, that really inflamed that US Pluto return, but also really gave a sense of pessimism to people. That's what was so powerful when the Harris campaign had that wonderful post-Olympic moment when it broke through that dense, suffocating aura of pessimism, and suddenly all of this joy and love was released. And there was a feeling that there could be this wonderful new future, and it didn't have to be old white men oligarchs for the rest of American history. So those kinds of planetary positions very much contribute to that feeling that of hopelessness and apprehension about the future. But we're going to have such big changes in 2025. We have those planets changing position. Pluto already has, but now we're going to have Saturn and Neptune going into Aries, which that's a big change from Neptune to Aries. It's not just a cycle. It's just the quality difference between those two signs is so palpable. And I think that if you now consider the Saturn-Neptune conjunctions that are upcoming for 2025, we have first a nearly conjunct in the 29th degree of Pisces. Saturn and Neptune meeting in the 29th degree of Pisces, roughly. They're off by a fraction of, I think, like 1 degree. And that degree, just like 29 Capricorn, but even more so because it's Pisces, it's the end of the whole zodiac. That degree causes, again, these feelings of endings and of culmination and of infections, like blisters that burst kind of thing. It becomes undeniable what's really going on. That occurs for us in 2025 twice. First, when Saturn and Neptune meet in Pisces, which will probably be when we really feel that sense of, wow, don't know what's going to be. It could be flooding. It could be issues around water. It could be uh, really terrible weather events because you've got Saturn Neptune together. Saturn Neptune has been involved in situations that have to do with epidemics, and we have bird flu percolating and some other things to keep an eye on. And usually with Saturn Neptune conjunctions, what you get is a disaster that makes the government look helpless. When you have Saturn conjunct Pluto, you tend to have disasters like epidemics that the government overreacts to and people react against the government. And that's precisely what happened in 2020. We got Saturn conjunct Pluto right on schedule. We got COVID, and everybody, not everybody, but many people thought that the government overreacted and there was a lot of hostility toward the government. Whatever happens next is going to be more like Katrina. It's going to be something that we watch in horror and the government seems inept to help people, and it causes a general sense of discouragement or disillusionment with our institutions. That's coming up in the beginning of the year. And then when they meet and they actually conjunct in Aries, so you've got Saturn and Neptune at 0 degrees Aries, another extremely important and powerful degree as the commencement of a whole new cycle around the zodiac, and really a symbol of rebirth, of a new order. um, that is going to happen too over in 25, 26. And that is a huge change in mood. I think that the mood when Saturn and Neptune come together in Pisces will be dark. I think that people will feel even more of that sense of endings and of the ends of institutions. And we're going to have the most pessimistic kind of viewpoint as the changes that are proposed begin to take shape and to actually be implemented in whatever ways they can be. And I think people will be reacting in rather a dark way to that, feeling it's the end of America kind of thing. And then I don't know how it happens, but when we get this Saturn and Neptune in Aries conjunction, we have the opportunity for a very different response. And I don't know if this is generational. There's so many scenarios, bad and good, that could coincide to this. So a lot of astrologers are looking at war with Neptune and Aries, especially civil war, because we had Neptune and Aries during the Civil War. We're also about to have Uranus in Gemini, and that we have always fought wars, America has, during that aspect, often on our own soil, like, for instance, Pearl Harbor, but also the Civil War and the American Revolution. And so people are looking at that and saying, well, maybe we have violence in the streets. There's some sort of autocratic Christian dominionist takeover of the country or something. I don't know. I'm not going for those kinds of scenarios as much. I think that it does perhaps represent a reaction from people, and especially younger people who have had it and who want to launch new and better ways of doing things. Now, that could play into bad scenarios, such as there have been accusations that Elon Musk's real plan is he wants to crash the American dollar and make Bitcoin the world currency, which would make him even more incredibly, insanely rich than he already is, because he got into Bitcoin at something like, 1/100th of a cent or something when he first started buying it. And he bought a ton of it not too long ago with Tesla. So that's possible. I mean, that's the kind of scenario that could happen, but it could also be something very positive. It could be a cultural flowering, for example, where people embrace a much more positive attitude. Aries is springtime. It's rebirth. It's the return of life. So I think when we have Saturn and Neptune in Aries, and then we have Pluto in Aquarius, as we do now, we're going to have a very different zeitgeist, much lighter. So when people ask me, but oh my God, what's it going to be like going forward? I try to tell them it's going to feel better. I don't know why, but it will feel better, because the difference between Saturn and Neptune in Pisces and Pluto in Capricorn, and Saturn and Neptune in Aries with Pluto in Aquarius, is night and day. And it's this, the second one is fresh and future oriented, and everybody wants to get started again instead of being obsessed with endings. So I hope, and in fact, there's another thing about Saturn Neptune, by the way, because it can represent times when, for instance, Pisces, Christianity, there's Neptune, Saturn, we want to tell you what to do. We're going to make laws so that you can't do things that we don't think you should be able to, because women should be at home in the kitchen, or whatever kind of reactionary thing they're going to be selling. That is, that is Saturn Neptune, that desire to make my religious beliefs the law, and everybody has to conform. But Saturn Neptune can also be a renaissance, because Neptune can represent the highest levels of meditation, the highest levels of spiritual understanding, the highest levels of inspiration. And Saturn gives us the power to grab hold of that inspiration and to capture it in some form that allows people that read it or view it or otherwise encounter it to change their lives. And so that opportunity will also be there with that Saturn Neptune going on.
Yeah, I think that's the hopelessness and the victim mentality of Pisces. And if you are a Pisces, there's so many beautiful things about Pisces. We're talking about kind of this heavy collective energy
Mhm.
where I do believe, like, as that comes around and, kind of giving the context that we have, that there are going to be a significant number of people that are going to feel depressed and
Mhm.
hopeless and like it's over. And sometimes when something's over, you get to let go.
Yeah,
And in the letting go is where something new is born.
exactly.
And that's, I think, that is a little bit how I'm already starting to feel, is like, oh, it's over. Like we all geared up, we've been working so hard and oh, that didn't happen the way I wanted it to. But now I have to accept and I have to not feel sorry for myself. I have to let go and let it play out. And that's a part of, I think, the healthiest response instead of getting super depressed or super blue, is recognizing like we need to let it play out, because in
Yeah.
the playing out is where something new is going to come along.
Yeah. And I think, the enemy is speculation. We can't trust sources. I love Heather Cox Richardson. I think she's, a wonderful writer. There are sources out there that have clarity, but for the most part, we can never be sure of almost any of the sources that we encounter about information, and especially theories about politics. And it's so easy for us to fall into a state of apprehension where we're using that Neptune to constantly have Saturn visualizations about what comes next. And so we kind of uh, prepare ourselves to fail because that's our expectation. We lost the war, it's over, and now we just have to try and survive. What are we going to do? Leave the country? Are we going to, go out into the woods with guns? And I hear liberal people talking about that now. It's amazing to me. This is the thing about shadow experiences, the mirror effect.
Yes.
That the accusations that are going from side to side are almost identical, and that now it's reversing, right? Because Biden was president and it was a Democrat's world. It was the Republicans saying, I've got to grab guns and a bunch of food and I'm going out there because the Chinese are going to take over because that's who owns Biden or something like that. And now I'm hearing people on the left saying we got to get guns and go live in the woods because the Russians are going to take over because of Trump. It's the same thing. That's what's so weird about it.
It's fear. And I think that's the thing that's a very human condition, is we want control. We want to know what's going to happen. But
Yeah.
I've been doing tremendous amount of research about what happens during Pluto and Aquarius, what happens during Neptune and Aries, what has historically. And it's all different. They have
Yeah.
similar themes, but the combination, we actually, anybody who says they can predict the future with certainty is not telling the truth, or they're
Mhm.
deluding themselves as well. There is no certainty. And as humans, that's incredibly uncomfortable because we want to know that we're safe. We want to know that there'll be a meal tomorrow for our kids. We want things to stay the same. But clearly, things have gotten so broken that there's enough of us that didn't want things to stay the same. And they were willing to risk everything for that. Now, whether it's propaganda that did that, or whether it's misogyny and racism, or whether it's just economic disparity, doesn't matter. This is the energy that we're dealing with right now. And we've got to dispel that fear and see our own shadow, because that's that Mars opposite Pluto too. But that's also a democratic shadow, is that we don't fight back, and we bring a pencil to a knife fight. Like we
Mhm.
at a certain point, and that's where I think the nodes right now, like, are trying to get along at all costs and not seem political completely backfired. And I think it was political. Like,
Mhm.
I think that is political. And I think that's a shadow where you've got some serious Charlie Brown syndrome, where you've got to like stand up for yourself at a certain point.
Yes, and also look at, I mean, we had discussed the 20th century mentality versus the 21st century mentality. So as we're viewing, let's say the DNC from a 20th century mentality, we're saying this is beautiful. Listen to what's being said. Look at the spirit of these people, and look at the color, and women are in positions of power. What a celebration, much like the Olympics was. And then we look at the RNC, and from that 20th century point of view, and we go, what a shit show. This is just a circus. I mean, what can you get another crazy person out there to do something weird? And then you realize that actually that 20th century perspective of uplift and it was out of sorts with the time in some sense. And this message of unity, let's focus on one thing. The Cheneys. So I thought it was very brave what Liz Cheney did. And I thought she was very eloquent. And yet, if I don't know how the Democrats didn't understand this, but I mean the world that I came from, the worlds of punk and then Burning Man and that stuff, I mean Cheney is like Antichrist. And he is the living symbol of the deeply entrenched neoliberal militaristic idea of how to rule
And corruption.
and corruption. And so I understand that what the Democrats are trying to do was to appeal to the old GOP, to people who perhaps had ethics that would not permit them to support somebody like Trump. And they were painting themselves as the party of unity by opening their tent to all of these people, these Republicans that were disaffected. But there was another level of message they were sending, which was now we're in bed with the most corrupt neoliberal warmonger in recent American history. And so the lies that are being told about us now look even more believable to the people who believe them, because why on earth would we embrace a monster like Cheney?
Well, and it's really funny because I remember being out in the streets protesting the Iraq War, and I've always been a Democrat. I've always been very liberal. And the narrative switch where all of a sudden, like, Republicans decided they didn't like the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, right? But they were the ones eating freedom fries back in 2000, not
Yep.
me. And it's really interesting how I've seen like all this back and forth, and people who definitely voted for W, who had stickers on their cars, say how horrible he is. And just the
Mhm.
fact that like the DNC can't get that like somehow we ended up holding the bag for that war that we all were the ones begging them not to do. You know,
Mhm.
Obama voted against it, Hillary voted for it. Obama was handed a very challenging situation. And
Yeah.
then we look and we see, and I do like to set the record straight for anybody who is watching, is that, Biden executed Trump's plan. I do not like that Biden executed Trump's plan. He should not have done that.
Right.
He should have had the balls to say no. Now,
Yeah.
that was Trump's plan. Trump let 500 Taliban out of prison. He invited them to Camp David. And now women in Afghanistan are suffering more than they ever have been. And no one talks about it. And
Women's
so,
voices are outlawed in public.
and laughing.
Mhm.
And yeah, and you can't talk to another woman. I mean, some really torturous stuff is happening there that rivals anything that's ever happened in history of cruelty.
Mhm.
And I say this and I bring this up because of the big hodgepodge and the whole like propaganda and fake news and fake media and the switching and the flip-flopping,
Mhm.
and the fact of the matter is like none of us want this, and it is all the people at the top that have been pulling these strings
Mhm.
that have messed up, frankly.
Oh yeah. Well, I mean, the funny thing to me is that it's not funny. Actually, it's kind of great. To hear Americans such as yourself, disappointed in America because for years, let's say 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s at least, the general feeling was America sucks, America's an empire, America's controlled by crazy people. The government always does things that screws us up, you know, and because of Obama, I think, and even to a degree Biden, who comes in after Trump and who settles down a lot of stuff, that we were sort of lulled into this feeling of, you know, wow, but America should be great. America should be fighting the good cause. That's what we expect from America. That's healthy. I'm glad to see that people are disappointed because there wasn't a belief like that. Like I'm telling you, like most people in the 60s or 70s would have just been cynically, you know, smirking about it. Just, well, yeah, what'd you think they were going to do? You know, it was such a negative attitude after Vietnam and other things, Watergate and such. And so I think that these expectations for America to live up to its potential is also a positive thing that we can see through this election, which has been a tremendous mirror for America. I mean, what an incredible, like, I mean, we all have been getting a lesson in anger and the manipulation of anger and the manipulation of facts and the difference between you know, Rachel Maddow's well thought out hour-long recitations about current events or Heather Cox Richardson's wonderful multi-paragraph descriptions of what's going on in the country, and people who have no time or interest in that. People who don't, you know, really have the time to sit down and do a ton of research about what's true and what's really happening. They're looking at memes, their friends are sending them, they're seeing something on Fox News or whatever they're getting on Twitter, and that's where they're getting their news. And that there are also many people whose idea of doing research now is diving deep into the world of QAnon and to other places where conspiracy theories are hatched and proliferate. I mean, Twitter showed the way that a platform can provide as Musk loves to talk about, a community square kind of experience where we all get together. We get the news right away because the people that are there are actually live streaming what's really happening. Obviously, it's not that simple, but there's some truth in that. And you separate it from those pressures that come from the this hierarchical structures of media companies, that come from the needs of the advertisers who are paying for all this stuff. And if people are curious, by the way, for instance, if you watch MSNBC, spend some time listening to Oberman's podcast on YouTube or somewhere else. Keith Olbermann, who was one of the people who founded it, and he will tell you that MSNBC at the top is corrupt and filled with really people who are conservatives and who don't want the liberal message to get out there too well. And the infighting between the stars trying to control the platform. And it's a mess. I mean, the media, as it has evolved, is a mess and something that is no longer dependable. And so we need to invent. And now the beautiful thing is that Pluto in Aquarius is all about invention. And so you had mentioned in our conversation Henry VIII. And we always see Henry VIII as somebody who broke the power of the Catholic Church, basically for his own desires to loot the churches in England and to get the right to divorce and marry again. But he did break the power of the Catholic Church. And he also was someone who innovated, who the very idea that he could do that he could say, screw the Pope, I'm the head of my own church, was this dramatic kind of Aquarian innovation that changed the whole dynamic that had been dominating Europe for centuries. And so I agree with you when you use him as a kind of metaphor for Trump. You get somebody in there whose motivations may be bad, but they go in there as a bull in the china shop and they open things up. They break down old barriers. They may do things wrong and set up bad situations. So you get Henry's daughter Mary, who's a Catholic, takes over and starts killing Protestants. They call her Bloody Mary. She's so vicious. But then you get the Elizabethan age, which certainly had its negative aspects, establishing the slave trade and the very beginnings of it, and
But it
really
also
more.
changed the whole world.
Absolutely.
I mean,
And you
that's
think
it.
the yes, and the art that was created, right? The amazing revolution in art. It is like something like what happened in Florence, when you had this incredible explosion of art and ideas and philosophy and magic and all of that happened in England as well. And I think that we're also due for that here, because generally when we have this kind of a political climate, it does lead to people being more interested in spirituality, reacting more powerfully to the arts that fulfill Aristotle's dictum that the artist must reacquaint people with reality, right? We all become very concerned with capturing our own reality and sharing it during a time when people are telling us there is no such thing as a consensus reality. We want to preserve what we've experienced so that maybe in the future it might be useful for somebody who's facing similar situations. Whereas when you're in a regime that is supportive of your ideals, more or less, there's not a lot of motivation to take on that struggle, to say those difficult things, to make your creativity into something real and not just a hobby, but something that can affect not just your own time, but future times. And I believe that this new combination we're going to see with Uranus moving out of Taurus into Gemini, that's kind of crazy in itself. But Uranus in Taurus is such a they just don't get along. I mean, Taurus is
Antithetical energy.
all about stability
Right.
and so the stability of our financial system, the stability of everything is questioned. And people are wondering if they're going to wake up and there won't be any money in the bank all of a sudden. And this is part of that Uranus. It's funny because Uranus is like a trickster, and it's this kind of gee, we don't know what's going to happen, do we? But all of the financial institutions look so shaky, and Bitcoin's there, but it's new and weird, and there's been a lot of scandals, and billions have disappeared. And what do you do? There's nothing. There's nothing you can choose. It's all a battle between Uranus saying nothing is stable and your natural Taurian desire to have some stability in your life. When Uranus leaves that and goes into Gemini, that's a shit show of its own, right? I mean, Gemini is erratic enough, but you throw Uranus in there and you get that Gemini opposition between two points of view amplified by Uranus. Wow. But on the other hand, Gemini can articulate Uranus. Gemini can see both sides of an issue. Gemini is going to allow Uranus to do things that help us to evolve our society and how we communicate and interact with each other, and how, therefore, government works. As we need to update Gemini, we need to update how we communicate, how we vote, how the media works, all the things that have to do with information exchange that are being affected. How do we deal with AI? Is it friend or foe? All these questions are going to really come to the forefront.
I
And
want
all
us to do a part two where we really
okay,
dive into Uranus in Gemini and we're talking about Neptune in Aries for 2025, because I think that that is a whole other discussion. And
okay.
so I want to just kind of make this into a two-parter. So first of all, I want to thank you for your time and make sure to check out part two. And so that brings me to that there is a reason and a season for it all. And the universe is conspiring to help us, even if it doesn't feel like it always. When you trust that and you know that, that is a way to center and remind yourself that there are bigger things happening and we don't know the end of the story yet. So,
Yeah, and we're here to learn.
yeah,
Remember, it's a school. So this is about learning, and difficult times are great for learning.
amen. All right. Till next time, stargazers.